Good evening, and welcome to 7 Stories Up, a book about Ray by Ellen Levy with Allison Nellis. We're delighted to have you all joining us tonight at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. My name is Tim Smith, and I'm an Adult Services Librarian here at SNFL. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making programs like this evening's conversation possible. I would like to encourage you to visit NYPL's website and take a look at upcoming programs like this one. We have an excellent lineup this season featuring new nonfiction, music, and more. We would love for you to join us in this space again. And it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Ellen Levy is the author of Criminal Ingenuity, Moore, Cornell, Ashbury, and the Struggle Between the Arts, as well as essays on poetry, visual art, theatre, and film. She has taught at Pratt Institute, Vanderbilt University, and the School of Visual Arts in New York. Ellen will be in conversation with Allison Nellis, who is our supervising librarian of programming and outreach. And it's now my pleasure to welcome tonight's guests.
Hi everybody.
Hello, and
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, we're all here to hear Ellen discuss her new book, a book about Ray. So now that the book is out, how do you feel? Because it's been a really long time coming.
Yes, this was a sort of 9-year project. I'm a slow worker, but also we can talk about this, but there was a lot to do. This is the first book that, let's see.
I think you got it upside down.
Okay. This is the first book about Ray Johnson that really covers the career. So this is a story that hasn't been told before in sort of soup to nuts way. And that's always harder, you know? I mean, as an academic, I was always piggybacking on other people's story of someone else, and you read it and you think, I can add to that. But this was having to work through a lot of material and then give it a shape.
Cool.
And so yeah, it feels unreal to have it out in the short version of that.
Are you sick of Ray Johnson now, or are you just like, I'm done?
Oh God, no. Everyone around me is done. That's different. But I think I will never be tired of Ray Johnson. He is, we were talking about this before, an endlessly funny person.
Yes.
And an endlessly mysterious person. And just an endlessly endless person. And again, we can talk about that.
So what was the writing and research process for this book?
Okay,
Kind of like-
so to explain the writing and research, you have to know, and some people here may and other people won't, Ray Johnson's media as an artist. He had 3 practices. One was collage, and he did collage in an unusual style, an invented style that's not quite like what a lot of people think of as collage. And that was sort of frameable gallery work. He did performance. He was a very early performance artist, but he is best known for correspondence art and for being the godfather or pope or founder or something of correspondence art. And correspondence art, I have some of it up here, is, you can see, decorated mail of one kind and another. But if you look closely at all the pieces I have up here, they say, please send to. Please send to Remy Charlotte, who was a dancer with the Merce Cunningham Company. Please send to Jim Rosenquist, who was a great pop artist, and so on. And what happened with the mail art is it was sent along routes among different correspondents. It was a form of social media. It was a proto-social media form, and he is now thought of as kind of a founder of social media as we know it. So there is, he started doing this with friends of his, right? Really close friends, Charlotte and Rosenquist and Carl Wirsum and Henry Martin, who are on these other pieces. They were dear friends of his, but then the circle started to expand into the art world and into kind of other worlds, and then it just expanded, and eventually he was corresponding with hundreds and then possibly thousands of people. So And also, you wouldn't just get one of these things. You'd get a lot of things in an envelope, and you had to take account of all of these many things in the envelope, and each of these things would go on different routes across the network. And so there is just a ton of stuff. There is so much stuff. No one is ever going to see all the stuff that there is. And, you know, you said, did I get bored? The weird thing is, I've seen thousands of, and it's all different. I mean, there is overlap. He did things, he sent some of the same Xerox pieces to people, but there's so much individuality and so much humor and so much visual invention that it was really never boring. But again, oh, well, we can go back to that. But just a sort of, for instance, of what I went through, this is what Ray Johnson's house looked like after he died. Ray Johnson, and those of you who know him know this, killed himself in January 1995. And he left his house as a kind of installation. And the only thing, everything is, you can see this, everything's sort of facing inward or packed up, except this portrait of Ray Johnson by Chuck Close in the center, which he put facing outward to greet you as you came in. But eventually, all of this stuff ended up in what is now the Ray Johnson estate. He died intestate with only some cousins as survivors, so it went to he had a vexed relationship with galleries, but there was a gallery that had shown him a number of times when he was showing in galleries, and they ended up with the estate. And you see these pictures, these are part of what was in the house, and I have been through most of what was in the house. I have also been through everything that was in these rooms. This is the other great archive of Ray Johnson material, which was collected from the time Johnson and this guy, William S. Wilson, were in their 20s and became friends. And Bill Wilson, who was an English professor, decided he would become Ray Johnson's archivist, which Ray Johnson needed because he worked in all these ephemeral ways. He worked in all these ephemeral ways, and he also knew all these people. And the archive is both an archive of things and an archive of relationships. But it was an enormous amount of material, and all that material is now, after Bill died in 2016, it ended up in a wonderful home at the Art Institute of Chicago, and is now all digitized. So if you are interested in Ray Johnson, this is a fantastic trove, and so what was the research? And then everybody else has boxes, and lots of libraries have caches, and so on and so forth. So
as we kind of get into the content of the book, I think the first question I have is, why did you decide to name a book about Ray Johnson a book about Ray?
Yeah, a book without a subtitle, which is maybe a little risky to do, because if you don't know, you don't know. But somehow I always wanted it to be that way, in part because I think of this as a bit of a novelistic biography. I want you to feel absorbed in his life, and it's well, I'll talk about that if we want to. But so here's the cover of the book, and beside it are two artist books by Ray Johnson, both of which were sent through the mail page by page. One is from the 60s. It's called A Book About Death, and it had 13 pages, which were sent out again along the paths, and nobody ever received all 13 pages except, I think, maybe Bill Wilson. Why it's called A Book About Death is a question. It's not exactly a book about death, but death means something complicated and mysterious to Ray Johnson. So we can talk about that too, but he liked the idea of the book as form. He's a real librarian's artist.
I can agree to that.
Yeah.
A librarian's artist, but also a librarian's worst nightmare.
Yeah, can you say a little more about that?
No, because I feel like if we are collecting and we get somebody who's submitting something page by page, I would just be like, I'm not doing this. I'm not playing this game with you.
But in fact, a book about modern art was sent to a librarian. I think you know this story because it's in this movie, How to Draw a Bunny. That's a wonderful movie about Ray Johnson from 2002. And he was friends with Clive Philpott, who for many years was the head librarian at the Museum of Modern Art, which did not collect Ray Johnson in his lifetime. One Ray Johnson collage early one, found its way into MoMA during his lifetime, kind of a collector gave it, but they did not collect him. And he and Clive decided they would remedy that because, so he started sending Clive page after page after page of this thing called A Book About Modern Art, which really no one has ever seen. There's a unique copy on the shelf of MoMA, and when I tried to find it, it took a while because they said, oh, that's not a book, that's correspondence. That it wasn't in the archive. It turns out it was among the books on the shelf, but hardly anyone has seen it. This is a book that has to be reprinted. But it was part of a series of books called A Book About, from a book about death to a book about modern art. And that is the long, short answer to why it's called A Book About Ray.
Yeah, and just to kind of go back to, he's a favorite of like librarians. I think a lot of what Ray does intersects with a lot of interests that librarians have, like mail correspondences. A lot of us really like Emily Dickinson.
As did he.
Yes, and which we'll talk about in a little bit. But also, a lot of us are into things like zine culture, which is very reminiscent of this. And I'll also ask you a little bit about, not to spoil anything, but I think that's why I think a lot of us like Ray Johnson. And also, there's this very chaotic energy about it.
Yeah.
Which brings me to my next question. Actually, my next kind of statement. In reading this, I had no idea how funny Ray Johnson was. I was familiar with his art, but in reading his correspondences, I was like, this man is hysterical. And there's a quote from you that says he has a theatrical disrespect for the convention of their craft.
I was speaking of biographers, that is, or interviewers.
Yeah. And I think he's one of the funniest artists that I've ever read about. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. And then also about this, I think, one part of his career that I think sums up how funny he is. But there is a certain piece at the Avant-Garde Festival that features a helicopter and hot dogs.
Ray Johnson, there are Ray stories. People who know about Ray Johnson know the Ray stories, and How to Draw a Bunny is a kind of canon of these crazy Ray stories. In some ways, I was slaloming around the Ray stories because I really wanted to deal with him as an artist. And the Ray stories can get in the way of understanding and appreciating the art, but they're irresistible.
They're delicious even sometimes.
Yeah. Well, with hot dogs. Yes. So he did performances, and he was involved in a peripheral way with Fluxus, if you know Fluxus, which was, a loose group of artists headed up by George McCunis, but it involved most famously Yoko Ono, but a lot of other really terrific artists. And they did anti-art, and they did a lot of performance and performance scripts. And Charlotte Moorman, who was known as the topless cellist for the performances she did with Nam June Paik, had this thing called the Avant-Garde Festival that was kind of a Fluxus-based festival every year for a number of years in New York. And Ray went to a couple of those, and one year he was invited, and he got his gallerist, Richard Feigen, who is a very elegant man who deals in artists and secondary market art from previous centuries. He got Richard Feigen to hire a helicopter to take him from Long Island, where he lived, and to drop foot-long hot dogs on the island where this festival was that year. And he was appalled that people ate them.
That is really
after
disgusting.
They hit the dirt, yes, but this has become part of the why Ray. He had his reasons. He had a thing about, phallic, of course, but he just had a thing about things that measured 1 foot at the time. And because he was doing things called feeding, feedings where he would use footprints as part of images. Tracing body parts was a thing for him. And that actually has some serious implications, or serious aesthetic implications, but the hot dogs don't.
Yeah, and another kind of point of discussion as I was reading through this book is how much of his story is reliant on not just him, but also the people around him.
Yeah.
What was it like kind of getting into that world of his? And I did want to ask you about one person in particular that we have in common.
Okay, yeah, I know this, but
Yeah.
let me go back to this slide. So, yeah, social media, lots of people got mail, and he also had a lot of real friends. He had an enormous social reach. Everyone in the New York art world knew him. If you are interested in anyone in the New York art world from 1955 to 1995, and you ask, did Ray Johnson, the answer is mostly yes. But he also eventually, in '68, started holding these things he called meetings, in which people from the Mail Art Network plus other people he knew would be invited. And the mailer on the left is from one of the very first meetings, and it has these little bunny heads, which were his signature. He would actually literally sign his letters with the bunny head, starting around that point. And they also served as portraits. In some ways, he was a portraitist all the way through. And the bunnies were portraits of people because they had names attached. It was, everyone is an artist. Everyone is, part of this network. And by being part of this network, everyone is an artist. And I've blown up some of the names. Some of these people you will know, like Cy Twombly, the painter, Virginia Dwan, the legendary gallerist, Joseph Kosuth, another painter, another artist, word artist, Les Levine. Other people you won't know, they were friends of his or really, really oddball members of the art world. But yeah, there was, I looked up a lot of names, a lot of names, and learned about a lot of really interesting lives. A lot of, that was another thing that was never boring. Every time I looked up a name, I would go, oh, geez, what a story.
There's one person in particular that we have in common that I did kind of want to hear you talk more about, because I think his story is also very important to this. And that's Robert Warner, who unfortunately is no longer with us.
He died this summer.
Yes. What was it like getting to talk with him, and how does his work kind of factor into all of this?
So Bob Warner was a friend quite late in Ray Johnson's life. And like many people who became part of the Johnson Network, he knew someone. Actually, he knew, I think, one of those people's, Laura Benson, who's in the middle, third bunny up, was a designer who Bob knew just as a friend, and he saw her idea board that had some Ray Johnsons on it, and Bob is an ephemera collector and collagist, and he said, "What is that? Who is that?" And she said, "Oh, that's Ray Johnson. I'll put you in touch." And Bob, as you knew, was a very eccentric guy, very, very eccentric guy, and he and Ray really hit it off. Bob was my age, so 30 years younger than Ray, and he started doing stuff with Ray. Ray would just send him on errands. Like, for instance, Ray gave him a copy of the Declaration of Independence and sent him to John Cage's door, and had him knock on the door and ask John Cage to sign the Declaration of Independence, which he did. I mean, so Ray knew John Cage because he went to the, as they always say, famous experimental School of the Arts, Black Mountain College, where John Cage taught one famous summer, although Ray was most deep, and he got to know Cage afterward. living in New York, but Ray was a student of Josef Albers, the most influential teacher at Black Mountain, and also the Bauhaus in Yale. And Ray started out as a painter in the geometric mode of Albers, and then decided not to paint in the late 50s. At the exact moment when he started doing the Please Send Tos, he destroyed his paintings, and afterward only worked in performance and collage modes. So Bob was a partner in crime with Ray.
He's very much missed.
Yeah.
Another kind of through line of this book is the kind of the correlation between Ray Johnson and Andy Warhol. They both, paint famous subjects. They're both not paint, but they make art about famous subjects. They are both kind of obsessed with death. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship? Maybe not in an indirect relationship.
Well, it was a direct relationship. Ray met Warhol when they were both in their 20s. They were, I think, within a year of one another. They might have been the exact same age. And at the time, Warhol was doing drawings. He wasn't doing the art yet, the art we know him by, the pop art yet. And Ray was already kind of doing the mail art and the early collages. And he also, around the same time he met Warhol, started to do these things that you can see on the left. He did a series of pop portraits based on movie star images. This is 56-ish, and Warhol didn't start doing his movie star portraits until 61, 62. So, and Warhol and Ray knew one another very well, used to go out shopping for movie magazines together, hung out with the same people. They were part of the same crowd of gay men downtown in a lot of ways, although Ray knew the sort of wild end of that group. And Warhol eventually sort of shaved off the wild people. But in any case, they started out together, and they started out somewhat close in style and sensibility. And there's this inside joke that I've put up there, one of the scraps that Ray sent to his friend Carl Worsam, who is a Chicago Imagist painter. It's a clipping that says Pontiffs of Pop, and it's a bunch of pop artists, and you can see Warhol, and behind them is Warhol's Most Wanted Men. And Ray has stamped it, as he did a lot of his mail art, Collage by Ray Johnson. So in a sense, Ray is the Pontiff of Pop. He's the one who has arranged all these guys together as the Most Wanted Men. So so he's claiming authority over Warhol here in a jokey way. But Warhol, of course, got much, much more famous than Ray.
Yeah. Because even in the book, it's mentioned that Elvis #1, which is on the left, is kind of seen as like the Plymouth Rock of pop art.
This is Henry Geldzaler, who was the curator of modern art at Met at the time, close friend of Warhol's, good friend of Ray's. That's what he did a pop show in the 70s, and then for the catalog of that, he referred to the Elvis and a couple of other of the pop portraits as, the Plymouth Rock of pop art. But then Ray stopped doing those altogether after 2 years. He just thought, that's not who I am. That's too easy. That's too, well, what we love about Warhol, we love the sexy magnetism of the star face transformed into almost art, almost transformed into almost art. But when Ray Johnson did, when Ray Johnson did his pop portraits, they often don't have faces in them. Or if they have faces, if you look on the right, there's a portrait called René Magritte. But what you see is Montgomery Clift, not René Magritte. So the two kinds of famous, movie star famous and art world famous, are crossed there, as they often are in his work. and as you say, death too. All three of these have birth dates and death dates. And to get a sense of the range, you have a collage with the birth and death dates of Wanda Gag, who wrote the children's book, Millions of Cats. There was actually a great show of her work recently at one of the public libraries, I think.
Think so. Maybe across the street.
I think across the street. And it's beside it is Ray Johnson, 1927, 1966. He was constantly announcing his own death. Not constantly, but periodically. He would announce his own death at moments of change in his life. So death, in a sense, means rebirth here. 66 was a moment when a new style for him really clicked. And then you've got Marilyn Monroe, 1926, 1962, only it's not Marilyn Monroe, it's Mickey Mouse. They have the same initials. So there's this thing about name and fame, face and fame, death and fame.
Yeah, he seemed to be somebody who was kind of obsessed with fame. Like even in the meetings flyers showed earlier, there's like a spot for Shelley Duvall. He is naming celebrities in like his work, and also in some of his letters, just name dropping celebrities. Is this an artist who's obsessed with fame, or what is his relationship with fame?
Well, that I would say, if the book has a thesis, an idea, it's a book that does not have a thesis in any normal sense. I do not say, here's the idea behind this book. I didn't want to write that kind of book. I wanted to follow Ray Johnson's thoughts as his work developed over the years. I wanted to be as close to him as possible. I wanted to be a kind of over-the-shoulder person for him. And his voice segues in and out of my voice through the book. And he had a really, I say, here's a thesis word, dialectical attitude toward fame. He was fascinated by fame. He was known as New York's most famous unknown artist. This is a phrase that I repeat in the book. It was something someone said about him in '65, and it stuck because it fit. He wanted to be unknown, and he wanted to be famous. He showed in galleries for 13 years only because he just could not stand the money and fame circuit. It made him angry. He couldn't bear it. And yet he wanted to be famous in some way, somehow, like Emily Dickinson. It's the question, did she want to be published? Did she not? Why did she write all those things if she didn't? Warhol had I think that dialectical attitude to begin with, a kind of dark view of fame. But then that faded as he became the guy who would paint anybody for money. And he had to keep kind of reworking that in different ways. But Johnson, as a person who understood social media before social media, he understood what we know about it now, which is that we all want to be famous. This again, Warhol said. But when we get our wish, we find it's poison. We find it is deadly. We'll all get up and check our mail and check our Insta and check our whatever after this is done and wonder if anyone's seen us while we were sitting here. And this is not good for our souls. And Ray Johnson knew that then. He knew it then, and he was constantly subverting it, in part by including famous, unfamous cult people. What counts as fame, he was constantly questioning. And in what world are you famous? For instance, people who know René Magritte would not know Montgomery Clift sometimes, or people, and vice versa. But he was interested in the vagaries of fame, the contradictions of fame, the difficulties of fame, and the intense desire in every human being for recognition that in our culture gets diverted into the culture of fame. I mean, you fall in love with someone because they know you. They understand you. They see you. And that is a healthy and beautiful thing. But our culture wants to monetize that. And they have figured out over the years many ways to monetize that. And Ray Johnson understood this deeply. This I find the most interesting thing about him.
And that kind of brings me to, I think my next discussion point is like Ray Johnson and the idea of a parasocial relationship, where he's building these connections with people. Sometimes he doesn't even know them.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and even with the people he did know best, like, say, Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson was, I began to call, his friends become what I call friend fans, because they become part of the network, also because Ray Johnson was a very distant person. He, on the one hand, he was fantastic at an illusion of intimacy, and he had many friends who adored him. But he lived alone for most of his life, and he was very hard to know in a fully intimate way, except by 2 or 3 people, and even those people said they didn't really know him. So, the parasocial, what he called the New York Correspondence School. This was the name for his network. Someone suggested it. It was, the New York School was what some people called the abstract expressionists, and correspondence school art courses were what you took if you were an amateur artist back in the day. And so it was the combination of that. And that was, a parasocial realm. And it got more and more parasocial as he went on. Let's see what I've got there. Oh, yes, well, this gets to your zines. He became a real hero / kind of pet of male artists, correspondence artists who followed him. The correspondence art thing spread all over the world. And it spread especially to parts of the world where people were far from the centers of the art world. So there were a ton of them in Canada. There were a ton of them in Hungary. They were in interesting places. There were big networks, but the first ones were in Canada. And these are 2 zines, early zines done by networks of mail art people. The File magazine, which actually kind of was a real glossy magazine, as well as a zine, and had a long run, a very cool magazine, was run by General Idea, which was the name for 3 men who lived and worked together, were lovers. 2 of them died of AIDS in the 90s. One is still working and living in Berlin and holding up the General Idea torch. There are still shows of their work. They did a famous sort of AIDS icon where they took Robert Indiana's love icon and refigured it as AIDS. Anyway, so General Idea had this magazine, and Ray Johnson, you can see him in a couple of pictures in that spread, and they just worshipped him. And they came to New York to see him, and so on and so forth, as did John Jack Balin, who called himself Count Fanzini, and did a lot. And he was another Canadian male artist who did a lot of zines. And he got hooked up in New York, I think not through Ray Johnson, actually, but with one of Ray Johnson's close friends, a guy named John Dowd, who was the bartender at the Eagle, which was a tough West Chelsea leather bar. And John Dowd was kind of a famous bartender because the Eagle was a place that people went, and because he was gorgeous. And so, but he was also an artist, and he got together with John Jack Balin, and they did a whole series of zines, a lot of which featured Ray Johnson as the sort of apex celebrity of the zine world. So yeah.
I have two final questions before we open it up to Q&A. So get your questions ready. I feel like this is going to be a weird one to end up out of the content of the book. But let's talk about death. So Ray Johnson is somebody who is obsessed with death. I think we can both agree. There's even this great quote by Hilton Kramer that he's somebody who is, the quote is, "Yet what most impressed me about Ray at the time was that despite his sunny disposition and extraordinarily good looks, he already sounded like a man in mourning for his life." And this is in the early 50s.
Yeah.
So 40-something years before he eventually does pass away.
As Hilton Kramer, who, I talked about this recently, Hilton Kramer was the lead art critic for the New York Times, and he was a famous meanie, and he hated the avant-garde more than anything, and he became a real leading critic of the Reagan era. He started this right-wing magazine called The New Criterion and stuff. But this was way before, when he and Ray Johnson were both very young. They knew one another. And I was shocked. That sentence was written right after Ray died. And Hilton Kramer, this famous meanie who had had some really not nice back and forths with Johnson. Johnson made relentless fun of him. Remembered Ray as this beautiful creature who was at once sunny, as he says in that sentence, and ready to die. And this, all of his friends kind of said this. They loved him because he was so funny, so bright and light and energetic and energized others. And on the other hand, really ready to leave this world at any time. He did have what we call suicidal ideation through his adult life, and everyone was shocked by his death and not shocked. And a lot of his close people said it's kind of amazing he made it that long. He was 67 when he died. But death means something else to him, too. It means the dark side of fame. It means rebirth. That's the light side of it. He was interested in Zen, and he really did believe in constant death and rebirth in some, I don't think, religious way, but as an artist. He was constantly reinventing himself, and he loved that feeling of rebirth. So death is it's a strange one for him. Interesting.
And as we kind of wrap up our conversation for opening it up to the audience questions, what do you want people to get out of this book?
Well, I say it in the introduction. Because he's such a fugitive character, because he disappeared from the art world for long periods of time, because there's a lot of his work is hard to find, less so now with Chicago and other things, but still. Museums own it, but they often don't hang it. I want people to get a sense of who he was as an artist as a whole. I want people to finish the book, and when they see some of these strange Ray Johnson pieces, go, oh, yeah, okay, I know where this fits in. I know how this relates to that. I know what this icon is. I know what the technique means here. And then you can, if you have some of those anchors when you're looking, you can keep looking and make your own meanings out of it, as you must with art. And you can keep looking for more of his art. I mean, I want the museums to hang the art, for instance. So, yeah, and I want people to enjoy the book. It's meant to be funny. He is funny. I try not to compete with him, but one has to be lighthearted in writing about him. Because, I mean, he would make fun of you if you weren't. He did make fun of people when they weren't. So striking that balance was tricky, but fun.
Feeling Ray Johnson would just eat me alive. And that's fine. That's completely fine.
I'm not sure if I always wonder about that with me, too. Although, if you liked Bob Warner and you could deal with Bob Warner, good practice for Ray Johnson.
And he liked me, so
So there you go.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right. At this point, we'll open it up to audience questions. We have a mic floating around, so just raise your hand, and my colleague Tim will come over.
Yes, Madison?
Was there mustard and onion?
Nope. You had to eat them plain. I think there was dirt eventually. But, yeah, okay.
Oh, we're talking about the hot dogs. Okay.
Yes.
Hi. Can you just go all the way back to the send tos just for a second?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and I'm just curious about what the how they actually worked. Just the structure of them. Like did when it said send, please send to, was he sending that to somebody else to send to somebody else?
Precisely.
Okay. So who do we know who they were getting sent to be sent to? In other words?
Well, the very first, the one on the right is the very first one, so no one knew how that was going to work. He gave it to Bill Wilson to send to Remy Charlotte, who they both knew. But then he started, actually, something you find in his archive are these envelopes, and they have a zillion names on them, and some of the names are crossed out, and they kind of have, and they have like looping lines between them. And I'm pretty sure that those are the paths of sending.
So it was archiving as it went along.
Yeah, and you could kind of, you were not, the thought was it would come back to Ray, but often it didn't. Often some of them came back to him. A lot of them ended up in other people's collections. And like I said, you would get a whole bunch of stuff. So you could choose. But one of these has, for instance, 2 names. Please send to Henry Martin, who was a student of Bill Wilson's, who ended up becoming an art critic in Italy. And then to Carl Wersum, the painter. So it would have gone to both of them. And it ended up, I think, coming back to Bill, because I found it in Bill's collection.
So just, sorry, I don't want to go too far into
No.
it. But
Oh, and you could add stuff.
okay, so they were envelopes that had things tucked in. It would be addressed on the outside, and inside it would have something like this.
Yeah.
That would say, please take this
Yeah, you
and
would
send it
you would get a
along.
regular envelope.
Right, I get
Open it,
yeah.
and stuff would fall out.
Because there's a whole other area of correspondence art where you're mailing things that's the thing that you're mailing is the piece of art itself. And there was, I saw things that were, meant to sort of stretch the, the imagination of the post office as to what actually could be mailed.
Oh, this happened in Ray Johnson's mail all the time.
Yeah.
His postman was, after a while, not easily surprised. Mannequin heads with stamps on them. And yeah, once the mail art thing took off, and everything came to Ray Johnson, and crazy things. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not sure if this is a question. I think it is. I guess I'm just going to ask you to expound upon a few things. I think Ray Johnson has a reputation for being a bit of an enigma. And I just wonder how you feel about your understanding of Ray, both at the start of all of this and looking back on that now from where you are. Do you feel like you know Ray Johnson?
I know a lot more about him. I know a lot more about how he thought and what he wanted, because I've read his mail. This is a thing about Ray Johnson. There's an immense amount of evidence because he left it for us and he wanted us to get it. But he remains enigmatic. And the people who knew him in real life said the same thing. There's not a single person who said, well, there's one person, his friend Toby Spieselman, I think might have said she knew him. He let her in ways he didn't let other people in. But even Richard Lippold, his longtime lover, said at the end, I don't think I really knew him. I mean, they had an affair that lasted Lippold was married, but for 24 years. And Lippold said in interviews, I think I didn't really know him. So there's there will remain enigmas around him. On the other hand, yes, and it was utterly terrifying at the beginning. There was the, who are all these people? Oh my God. I mean, I knew a lot of them because I knew this period of the art world, it was my thing, but oh my God, so many people and so many complicated relationships. But, and I know him a lot better, but I do not presume to say I know him, no.
I'd like to sort of follow that up with another ask for you to expound. In addition to being considered such an enigmatic person, he was also known to be, a word that people might use is recluse. And there's a dichotomy, and you've spoken to this already, between the social media aspect and correspondence art and reaching out to the world. But then, isn't it true that there were maybe fewer than 5 times that someone else was allowed into the Pink House?
Yeah. So Ray Johnson lived in New York from 51 to 1968, and then he moved out to a house on Long Island where he lived for the rest of his life. And I mean, it's a really modest little house, and known as the Pink House because it was pink when he got it, but it wasn't pink after well, never mind. And he did not let people, Toby had her own room in the Pink House, but he didn't let people in the Pink House. However, he went out a lot. And I found out, interviewing people on Long Island, he had a lot of friends on Long Island who were artists. And he would go out to bars there, and he came to New York pretty much every weekend and would go to Soho and I write about this in the book. He would go to Soho, hang out, run around, do strange, enigmatic Ray Johnson things, leave packages at desks of galleries for people. And then he and a group of younger gay men would go out to bars all night. They'd go to the Anvil, they'd go to a bunch of places all night and hang out. And he was really known at the bars. And he would go to Max's Kansas City and hang out, and he was social, but he was also not social. There was a lot of private realm. So yeah, it's funny, a recluse and not a recluse.
The idea of him not being known well by people seems to be a recurring idea of the evening. Do you feel that could be related to why he took his life at age 67? Or do you have any other insights? Did he run out of projects? Did he find life, despite all the bar hopping, did he find life to be meaningless? Why did he end it all?
Here's what I say. I don't know, and we never will know. But here's what I said in addition to it. What I thought when I went into this is that because I hadn't seen the late work, that he had lost inspiration. But this turns out not to be true. He was in the middle of an extraordinary project, which I guess I can't really talk about at length, but the Morgan Library did a fantastic show of 2 years ago. It was this project of photographs that was a kind of recursive return to everything he'd ever done, and it was a brilliant project. And he was working these photographs into new collages that looked like nothing else. And this is a kind of proto-Instagram, the way the early stuff was like proto-social media. It's an amazing project. And he was making beautiful collages. So he hadn't lost inspiration at all. He really was going in new directions with the work. He worked up to the last moment. But as I said before, he had suicidal ideation. And this is clear from his mail.
What does that mean?
People who have persistent thoughts of suicide. If you are a suicidal person, you are a suicidal person. You think about it. It's hard to explain if you don't know what that's like. But if you're a person who suffers from suicidal thoughts, they're just there all the time. They're there all the time. And you think, well, that's what life is like, to have those in the back of your mind, along with everything else, with your grocery list and your love life and your everything. And he had that clearly. I mean, there's signs there. He makes this clear, in fact. He makes jokes about it and makes dark jokes about it in his early mail and up to the late mail. So he thought about this. So he might have done it at any time. Why he did it then, I don't know. There may be actually a life disappointment or a heartbreak or something, or just, I don't know. I really don't know. And we will never know. We do know that he made it seem deliberate, because he called people and he wrote people. There were a lot of warnings that people didn't quite get because he was such an eccentric person, that turn out to have been sort of about the planning of the death. But yeah, this is a thing about when people kill themselves. People say, why? The answer is because. I mean, you know, unless the police or the Nazis are at the door or something, you know. There's one more back there. If we have time. If we don't, we don't. No, we do. Yes.
I'd like to ask a question too.
Yes.
You're obviously the authority on Ray Johnson.
No, but there are others.
But it's not only that it is a book of Ray Johnson. I think it's more than that. It's your life with Ray Johnson.
Well, yes, and this is part of, as Allison was saying, Ray Johnson is not an artist you look at from a distance. He engaged people. He engaged them, and this is part of the recognition thing. He was drawing, whoever you were, he would draw you closer and closer and solicit a moment of mutual recognition. This is what the art was. This is also a thing that Emily Dickinson did. And he knew that about her. And he in fact, if you look at the lower left hand, this graveyard piece with what he called his move stars, which were part of this photo project, there's a Ray Johnson bunny with New York Correspondence School in the middle, and next to it is that checkered silhouette, and that's Emily Dickinson's profile that her father had cut for her when she was young. And he used that in a lot of his late work. But yeah, so, yeah, I mean, any biographer becomes intimate with their subject, but you always do feel drawn in by him.
In all your research, all this time spent on the book, what surprised you the most? What did you learn that surprised you the most?
Oh, that's a great question. There were so many surprises. It was very surprising to find out how brilliant the work he was doing at the end of his life was. I was sure that from a few things I'd seen, that he had lost his inventiveness. And he was really moving into a new phase, and it was it was as smart and interesting as anything he'd ever done. That was quite a shock. I guess I could have expected the endlessness of the material, but the sense of, oh, geez, Louise, I will never see it all. No one will ever see it all. I used to, at first, people would say, would you like to look at my box? And I'd be, yes. And then I would be, yes, and oh, no. And this was yes, but I am in archive withdrawal now, though. I need a program. Maybe you guys have one.
Oh God.
So
About how many collections are there? I mean, larger collections, because I feel like the boxes are endless.
well, there are the two very large collections which are currently at the estate, although eventually it will have to find a home somewhere. And as you say, I mean, these are, as a librarian, you can understand the accession of Bill Wilson's archive was not an easy lift for Chicago and the librarians, because, well, people were always saying to me, oh, how great that you're getting all the background on this, reading his mail, and I'm like, no, this is not the background. This is the sort of background, foreground, and librarians don't know what to do with it, because is it art? Is it archive? Is it, what is it? And how do you display it? How do you dispense it? So there are the two big ones. There's the estate, and there's so fantastic that the thing is in Chicago. But there are other places like Henry Martin's stuff, which is really important and beautiful, is in Vienna. The mail art people have a lot of their stuff in Vancouver, where another big mail art group was, and in Toronto, where General Idea was. And the Smithsonian has a ton, because the Smithsonian Archives of American Art has all these artists and gallerists, and 40 or 50 of them have Ray Johnson connections, so there's Ray Johnson mail. And those, also the Getty. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Go for it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your sensitivity to Ray and not falling for his, I don't know what the term is, but his list of fans, his homage to Shelley Duvall and thousands of others. I always saw them as poems, word poems, as you've pointed out, but your sensitivity, I can't wait to read the book. And of course, when people read the book, I'm sure you talked about the numerology involved in the night of his suicide, but
no, I did not. I did not. I somehow I couldn't go there.
In any case, it looked so pre-planned, but I must tell you, it was a great shock to everyone. Bill Wilson, most of all.
So your name is?
Fletcher Kopp.
Okay, and you were a mail artist in the network, yeah.
Around 65. Bill Wilson, was there from the beginning and to the end, and he was totally taken aback.
No, yeah, but they were devastated, and Toby never got over it.
Yeah, I'm sure. But the one thing I want to say is that when you got stuck with the whole carton of stuff, we have to remember that those came one at a time in the mail. You had to open the envelope, pull it out, even if there were 20 pieces in
your hand.
And you had an experience, and it was quite mysterious.
And this was also a thing that was surprising, that brought intimacy to it. I opened the envelopes as if they were for me, and I had that experience over and over again. Can I get one more question? Because Dee, who was an archivist at the Ray Johnson estate and knows a ton, wanted to ask a question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ellen. You did it, yay. I met Ellen.
You're wearing your Bill Wilson Zen t-shirt. Yep.
Had to do it. I just wanted to raise the question of Ray's queerness, because I feel like it came up a little bit in this discussion, but there are so many questions around the enigma of Ray and Ray's sort of like essential sadness in a way that I just feel like really speaks to queer identity, especially someone who lived in the era that Ray lived. He was born in Detroit in the 1920s, Midwest Scandinavian family. I think there's got to be something to that. And I don't know, I haven't read the whole book yet, but I wonder how much his queerness kind of comes into the narrative.
Well, I used to teach a class on his queerness comes in a lot. How could it not? And I'm drawn to queer figures, and this was part of the draw with him. This is also part of the funniness. This is Frank O'Hara. This is, there's the straight generation of painters, the abstract expressionists, who are very, 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 very serious. And the next and this is true of the poets too, people like Robert Lowell and John Berryman and so on, very serious, very straight. And the next half generation, they're almost all queer people, and they're all dry, funny, and enigmatic. And this is, you could say it's a defense mechanism and a hiding thing, but it's also an accessing of new resources and a making of a new kind of art. You know, and I used to teach this post-war poetry course, and there are a lot. Queer poets are the mainstream in American poetry, from Whitman and Dickinson to Ashbery and Ginsberg, but they're not all sad. And Johnson was both sad and happy, and he was more out than most people, as you know. Richard Lippold suggested that he get a beard, that he marry someone, that he marry Ruth Asawa, of all people, who had like the nicest husband in the world, who built her the most beautiful studio. But and Ray just did not. He was an authentic person who never wanted to compromise his authentic self. That's why he had to stay out of the gallery system. And he never wanted to, I think this was part of it, he didn't want to be, Warhol was terrified of being seen as gay, and he, rightly, because people said appalling things in public about Warhol when he got famous. Just horrible homophobic things that critics in newspapers felt they could say about a person. And Ray just he just always stayed right below there, and he could be who he wanted. And he was kind of a model to gay men of his generation who were coming out of marriages, like Dick Higgins. And he was a model to younger gay people, like the kids in General Idea. So, yeah.
What a great way to end off. So thank you, Ellen, for this. Hopefully all of you will get a chance to read the book. There's copies for sale outside. It's a beautiful book. And maybe Ellen will sign them for you if you would like.
Yeah.
So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you.